What's up, everybody? It's Drewby from DailyRoto here. I wanted to spend some time just walking through the beta of our NHL product and the different sections that you can find and some of the things you can expect, as well as talk to you a little bit about what is going into it. So you can see, you can kind of get to it by going to the NHL tab, and there's different sections if you want to go directly to the hockey stacks, the chat, or the projections. The projections are going to be my go-to starting point, and you can toggle easily back and forth with the three buttons at the top anytime. So from a projections perspective, there's a couple filter options that you have at first. Just simple filters at the positional level if you want to just look at centers or defensemen, goaltenders, or the wingers based on DraftKings positions. And then similarly, if you want to drill down into the projections of an individual team, we've got filters here. And then as we get more into the season where there are multiple days of slates showing up in the projections, we added a section here where you can toggle to the projections for a given date. And you can look, maybe it's Wednesday and you've already built your teams for the opening night and you want to start looking at the big GPPs on Thursday. You can kind of toggle the date filters there as well. So those are just the basic filters. If you think there are other helpful filters, definitely feel free to reach out to me and I can look into adding them. From the projections perspective themselves, it's also fairly simple, at least from like a UI perspective. So the first four columns are actually coming directly from the DraftKings CSV. So you have the position right here, the player's DraftKings name, their salary, the game info, and then the final projection is the first column that is put in by our team here. The projection takes into account a bunch of different variables. It takes into account even strength productivity, power play productivity, expected time on ice in both of those situations, as well as the matchup ratings for the opponents. And the matchup ratings for the opponents aren't just the offensive ratings, it's also incorporating the block shot ratings as well. So a team like Arizona was horrible defensively last year. We're a really strong team to attack with scorers, but because they don't generate a high volume of shots themselves, they actually were a negative rating for defensemen who block a lot of shots. And so those are some of the different variables that we have kind of baked into the projections here. So that's what the projection takes into account, and that's the ratings you can have here. You can see opening night. We have McDavid projected as our top scorer. We have Burns just behind him. The next column is a value column. So the value column is self-explanatory, but it's really just fantasy points per dollar adjusted to a scale. So you can see that on opening night, like Tyler Myers is one of our top values at the low price of $3,400. Not necessarily a top play of ours, but if you're looking to build out some of the value spots, then you might have Myers or a shot blocker like Radko Gudas, who might pop into your lineup. Not a ton of offensive upside at all unless you luck into anything, but still from a salary savings perspective, someone that you might be willing to consider in different formats. So that's the value rating, but going back to looking at kind of our top projected players, sliding across, you can see the depth. So most of our players are going to end up being, on the first or second line if they're up here, but with the team filters above, you can then use the depth chart filters to drill into the positions a little bit deeper. And then we have the teams here, we have the Vegas money line, and then one of my favorite columns here is the floor and ceiling percent for the players. So Burns is a good example. Philly was a strong defensive team last year. They're on the road, though, so that we take that into account as well. But we have McDavid a little bit ahead of Burns. So at face value, McDavid seems like the better play, given the salaries are both pretty premium. But if you look at Burns' individual floor and ceiling, he actually eclipsed that in a higher percentage of games last year than McDavid did. And so that's something that with the projections I like to take into account. It's not just running the optimal lineup. You also want to understand the floor and ceiling. And Burns is a guy, because of how many shots he takes and how many shots he blocks, that even games where he's not finding the score sheet, he's still producing great fantasy point outputs. McDavid, on the other hand, scores in bunches, but he needs to, right? He's not blocking shots as a forward, and he's a playmaker in addition to, a guy who shoots the puck a decent amount. So those are some of the things that I find particularly helpful when making my decisions. So I definitely lean heavily on the projections, but when in doubt between two players, I like to look at the floor percent and ceiling percent. The floor percent represents the percentage of games last year that this player hit 3+ points on DraftKings, while the ceiling represents the percentage of games that this player hit 6+ points. And so those I've found are good targets for cash games for the floor, and the ceiling percent for what you're looking for to win a large field GPP. You really want 6+ points out of each of the players on your team. Early in the season, you're probably not going to have a lot of luck with those metrics for the rookies because there's no sample. So they're just going to show up as zeros. So that is something that you should be aware of as you're kind of looking at that. But more or less, that's kind of how the projections are laid out and what they look like. The next thing I like to do is the NHL stacks. To me, this is the simplest way to get a quick and dirty view on stacks we might want to target for GPPs across the industry. And if I am like stretched on time and I don't have a ton of time to kind of dive into the slate and all the nuances, then the stack tool is definitely one of my go-to resources. So I can filter on DraftKings projection here, and I see easily that Winnipeg 1 and Winnipeg 2 are my top projections for the opening night slate, facing off at home, which is a benefit for teams against Toronto. So the DK projection just ties to the individual player projections from the previous tab. And then the value ranking does the same thing. So you're really not getting any new information in this view for those stacks other than a rolled up view of what we have on the previous page. But it is a nice reference. So you can see Winnipeg 1 and 2 are my top lines, followed by Edmonton 1, Pittsburgh 1, and then the two top scoring Toronto lines. The value column is also interesting because you want to understand, Toronto 3 isn't necessarily projected as high as 1 and 2, but they carry much cheaper price tags at only $13,300 total line salary. So they are a good GPP target for me at a strong value and possibly someone that will be a little bit overlooked. The next thing is the expected goals, and this is another thing that I like to take into account when making more qualitative decisions about GPP lineups. So this is derived using Corsi's expected goals model and adjusting for the individual matchup for those players. Expected goals models do not take into account the quality of a goaltender, so it's a good way to get an understanding of how the offense and defense will match up and how many goals against sort of a neutral goalie that line would be expected to score. So this is a good example where you can see, Winnipeg 1 and Edmonton 1 are really close from an expected goals perspective. Now, Winnipeg 1 definitely carries a cheaper salary, and I have them a little bit higher in projections. Edmonton 1 is probably a line that will still get ownership opening night. But if I felt like they were going to be low owned because of their price and the matchup, this expected goals model would indicate that there's actually still a good chance that they're the highest lines on the night. So I definitely lean heavily on the expected goals model. But again, with like rookies, it's going to be tough because we don't have past data on what their expected goals are. And we'll talk more about expected goals kind of as the season goes on. Line predicted individual Corsi 4 is a proxy for the shot volume for the individuals on that line. You can see Winnipeg is going to be a high shooting line. Philadelphia's first line is going to be a high shooting line. And so those are some metrics to look at as well. The line predicted scoring chances for is what it sounds like, as well as the total shots and block shots that line averaged, or the individuals on that line averaged last year. You can see the salary, and then you can also see the floor and the ceiling percent. So along with the expected goals, the floor and ceiling percent are great proxies for me to understand the upside that line possesses, because they might be a high projection line that hasn't historically displayed a ton of upside. So Pittsburgh 2 is a good example of a line that I don't have projected quite as high as some of the others. Part of that is trying to take into account St. Louis as a matchup and how much they may or may not have improved from last year or gotten worse from last year where they were a strong defensive club. But the floor and ceiling metrics show me that the Pittsburgh Lions still have a ton of upside, and it's important for me to try to take that into account as I'm building out my final lineup. So that's kind of the quick and dirty. The number of players is the number of players that are listed on that line. It's just a check basically to make sure that there aren't any issues. So sometimes DraftKings doesn't have a player in the player pool. A line might be showing low, or it might be a data anomaly with something I haven't picked up as well. So that's a check that you can have there. And then the date is the same as what we had on the projections tab. And then the last section is going to be the podcast and chat. As I'm video recording this right now, we obviously don't have any written audio or video content right now that's up here. What you will see is kind of the audio or video content above. Once I get this loaded, that's where it will appear. And then you can kind of see the beta chat version that we have down below where you can come in. You can have, if you want to check in on lineup alerts or just talk or just whatever, tilt your goalies, all that stuff's there. So that's about it for what we have right now. Really excited, to get a podcast or video live for opening night. And then we'll have another one on Thursday and we'll have one on Saturday. As I mentioned, we're going to be covering kind of the main GPP slates for DraftKings early in the season when there's great prize pools. We're definitely going to be covering more than just 3 days a week with our projections and the stacks and things like that. But as the season kind of grinds on a little bit, one of the things we didn't want to do was like roll out a product that would, not be used by a ton of people and wear down the people who are trying to contribute to it. And so covering like 3-game slates in the middle of February from like a all-encompassing content perspective wasn't something we felt like made sense at that point in time. So that's about it for now. Like I said, reach out to me on Twitter. My DMs are open. If you have any questions, reach out to me in chat. I'm happy to kind of talk through the process. I have had a lot of success playing my content and the projections myself over the past few years. And so I'm hoping that it's something that everyone else enjoys. And, we are in a beta right now. If the interest is there, we're definitely going to be putting up a paywall. It's a lot of information, a lot of work. And so it's not something that we're going to be able to get for free for long, but definitely want to incorporate as much feedback as we can and make this one of the better NHL communities, not just hockey products, but NHL communities as well for all of our users.